It's The Takeaway. I'm your host, Tanzina Vega, and we're coming to you from WNYC's The Green Space today, broadcasting in front of a live studio audience right in New York City. We just talked about the empathy gap here in the United States, and I think one of the reasons why there's this gap is also because we're all starting from different places, right? Literally, we're all starting from different places, and that brings me to the wealth gap. And here's what I mean when I talk about the wealth gap. In 2016, white families had the highest level of average family wealth. That was around $933,000. These are the latest numbers coming out of the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances. But what happens when we talk about black families? Well, black families' average net worth is $138,000. That's 15% of white families. Latino families also have considerably less wealth than white families. What am I talking about when I talk about wealth? I don't mean how much you make. I'm not talking about your income. I'm talking about your assets, your cushion, your fallback, your house, all of the things that you own that provide wealth. The 1% in the United States, 95% white. So we're going to talk about the racial wealth gap. Andre Perry is here with me in the Green Space. He's a Brookings Institution fellow and author of the forthcoming book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in American Cities. Thank you for being with us, Andre.
Thanks for having me. Happy anniversary.
Thank you. Andre, you know when we talk about money in this country and we talk about class and we talk about wealth, there's this working hard narrative.
Yeah.
Can we get that out of the way?
Yeah, I often lead with a conversation by saying there's nothing wrong with black people that ending racism can't solve. That constantly we're trying to fix people into making or blaming people for this wealth gap by saying that they need financial literacy and they need to learn more and they need to work harder, when in fact we know that wealth was created by essentially the federal government bestowing some assets to others, particularly after the New Deal, in terms of housing policy, and denying it through redlining and racial housing covenants to black folk and brown folk. So this wealth gap was created principally by the federal government, and we talk about collusion a lot in these days, but it was also private organizations, mortgage companies participated in this horrible act. But let's not go back, because we reflexively talk about redlining and housing, but remember that blacks were assets that were owned by other people.
And this is something that we find really hard to acknowledge, to continue to acknowledge in this country, the economic impact of slavery.
Absolutely. That still has an impact today. Slavery, segregation, Jim Crow. I recently did a study that looked at housing prices in black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. And after controlling for education, crime, walkability, and all these fancy Zillow scores that you find, that we found that homes in black neighborhoods are worth 23% less, about $48,000 per home, $156 billion in lost equity across the country. I mean, that amounts to about 4.4 million startup businesses. If you look at the average startup for black businesses, that would equate to about 8 million college degrees. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times. That $156 billion in lost equity was caused by slavery, segregation, and Jim Crow. And it still haunts us today. So we have got to have solutions to this.
We're going to take a quick break, Andre, but stick around. More for our conversation on the racial wealth gap in this country in just a minute. It's The Takeaway live from WNYC's The Green Space. I'm Tanzina Vega, and we're back with Andre Perry, a fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of the forthcoming book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in American Cities. Andre, we're talking about closing this gap. I've written stories, and there's been research that says it's going to take more than 200 years to close this racial wealth gap. That's outrageous.
No, but I put this.
You disagree.
I disagree, because the same way we created wealth for white Americans, we can create wealth for people who were disadvantaged by those same policies. So when we're talking about redlining, those community still exists. We can create metrics. Interestingly, there's so much talk about reparations. If you look at Georgetown University, they created a reparation package for their formerly enslaved employees there, well, not employees, workers there. And so this idea that you can't create a wealth building opportunity for those negatively impacted over generations is a falsehood. We have too much data. I, for one, looked at devaluation in Black communities, but we also can look at the various other workarounds to solve this problem. And if you're looking at a 2020 candidate who's really interested in solving this problem, see if their policies are directly trying to combat racism, segregation, slavery. If they don't mention those things, then it's not a sincere policy.
We should also be clear that we're not just talking about wealth in a Black and white framework. There are also Latino Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans who are also left out of this, of the spoils of wealth, if you will. One thing that's always stood out to me is the unemployment rate for Latinos is very low right now. And yet, when you look at the racial wealth gap and you add gender to it, Latinas are still the lowest paid of all women, period. All women.
Look,
so what does that tell us, Andre?
We're
working, but we're not getting paid?
Brown and Black women are at this nexus of gender inequality and racial inequality. They have a particular vantage point on how both these structural issues impact folks. So yes, in many cases, you can see people of color in a state of what we call full employment, but their wages are so abysmally low. It's because they're being exploited in employment. So you should not want for just employment. You should want for shared prosperity with employment to go along with it.
And I want to talk a little bit about, because this is now becoming part of the political dialogue for 2020, right? I've never heard candidates talk about racial wealth gap, reparations, and now everybody's got this on their these talking points. But I am seeing something interesting happening, and I'm wondering if you can speak to it. AOC, whether you like her or don't, one of the things that she's been talking a lot about is uniting the working class, right? Do you see, we are seeing labor changing in the United States. We're seeing rising labor movements. Government shutdown had an impact on American workers. Teacher strikes across the country. Lyft and Uber drivers are going on strike tomorrow. Is that the solution to closing this wealth gap more immediately?
Oh, it's definitely a part of the solution. We need folks to mobilize. If people do not mobilize, then we're at a disadvantage in terms of changing power. We're not going to wait for CEOs to figure out that structural oppression will deteriorate the livelihood of most Americans. We need to force them to see. And so I'm all for mobilization in these ways.
And you think this is something that we're going to see more of in the future? Do you think there's labor movement, particularly among people of color, is viable?
Absolutely. You saw it with the teachers, and let me, in red states and right to work states where you can essentially fire folks without recourse. You see white teachers. Now, they say when white people catch a cold, Black folk catch pneumonia. That's sort of the axiom there. And so if white folk are stepping out and saying, hey, I'm not earning wages, guess what? There's a whole lot of folks who will be willing to step out and demand their proper due.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Andre Perry is a Brookings Institution fellow and author of the forthcoming book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in American Cities. Thank you, Andre.
You're welcome.